Hello and welcome to our webinar, Simple Strategies to Help You Transfer LSVT Improvements to Your Daily Life. We're very excited to have you join us today from wherever you're joining us. And your presenters today will be myself. My name is Beth Peterson. I'm a speech language pathologist and one of the LSVT Loud training and certification faculty instructors. And I'm joined here by Laura Gousset, who's a physical therapist. And she's one of the LSVT BIG training and certification faculty instructors and the chief clinical officer for LSVT BIG. So we're very excited to be here today to present on this exciting topic. So there's a little more information in the slideshow, which is also in a handout for you for our biographies if you'd like to learn a little bit more about your speakers here today. And then in terms of disclosures, so all LSVT faculty have both financial and non-financial relationships with LSVT Global. The non-financial relationships include a preference for LSVT Loud and LSVT Big as treatment techniques. Financial relationships include that both myself and Laura Gousset are employees of LSVT Global and we receive lecture honorarium. I'm just going to go over a handful of webinar logistics so that you know what to expect here today. Right now, everyone in the audience, your microphone is automatically muted when you come into the session, and that's just to make sure that we don't have background noise from wherever you're joining us from. But there are a few ways that you can ask your questions. So you can ask your questions either by typing in the question box on your webinar control panel. So then we'll see the text of your question. We can read it out loud to the group and respond that way. You can also raise your hand. There's a hand icon on your webinar control panel. And if we see your hand raised, then one of us will call out your first and last name, and you can ask your question out loud to the group. We'll let you know that we're unmuting your microphone. And the third way, and you can do this at any time, is to email us, and that's info as in information, so info@lsvtglobal.com. And we'll have that email on one of the final slides of the presentation, so you have that for your reference as well. So there is a webinar handout for today, and it should have been emailed to you earlier today. It's also in your webinar control panel under the handouts tab, so you can click on that and download it. You can print it if you'd like it for your reference, so that's available. There will be a short survey that will pop up on your screen directly following the webinar. It should take 5 minutes or less to complete, but we do encourage you to take that so that we can make sure that our webinars are tailored to you and that you're really benefiting from them, and then that we can make any changes as needed to make sure that our webinar program, again, is as beneficial as possible to our participants. For the continuing education units, I'll go to the next slide here. So this webinar is not ASHA or state registered for CEUs for either speech, physical, or occupational therapy professionals who may be joining us, but it may be used for self-reported CEU credit as a non-registered or pre-approved CEU activity. So if you are a speech, physical, or occupational therapist, then you can email us after the webinar, so that webinars@lsvtglobal.com email address, and just ask us for a certificate, and then we'll send you a certificate so that you have that for your records, and then you'll just need to retain that certificate in the handout so that you have that again for your own records. It does take, we give the staff, it takes about up to 2 weeks for the certificate to be emailed. A lot of times it's just within a few days though. Attendance for the full hour today is required to earn that certificate. In terms of learning objectives, so at the end of the webinar, the goal is that our audience members are able to define what calibration is as it relates to movement and voice changes secondary to Parkinson's disease. Also be able to list 3 key deficits in Parkinson's that can make calibration challenging. And finally, be able to describe 4 areas of calibration that are integrated into LSVT Big and LSVT Loud treatment protocols to help facilitate that ongoing improvement in both movement and loudness into your everyday life. So we do have a quick poll that we'd like to launch here just to see who's joining us today. So let me see if I can get this up. And then if you can just take a moment and click the circle that matches you, again, so we can get an idea of who we're speaking with today. So we'll just take a few moments to let that go. All right, and it looks like, All right, we're getting a lot of votes in here. Okay, so I'll just do one more moment there, and then I'm going to close it, and let's see if I can share that on the screen. So it's about half and half. Individuals with Parkinson's disease or another condition, and then our allied health professionals, so PTs, OTs, and speech therapists. And then we have a few other healthcare professionals and family members or caregivers in the audience. So thank you for participating in that. Okay, let's make sure the screen is up there. Okay. So if you are a person with Parkinson's or work with individuals with Parkinson's, are you finding people are asking you to repeat yourself, or maybe they're leaning in to hear you better? Or do you find others or find yourself lagging behind others? Or do things like getting ready take longer than they used to? So these are some things that you might be experiencing with Parkinson's. Or maybe you're someone who exercises your voice, perhaps in a singing group or some type of public speaking group. But for some reason, your strong singing voice is not translating into a strong speaking voice. Or likewise, maybe you exercise regularly, but you find everyday things like getting your socks on or buttoning a shirt, getting up from a low sofa or out of bed to be challenging. So why might these be occurring? So we'll talk today about barriers to generalization. And these are barriers to generalization of either using a louder voice or larger movements in your everyday life. And we'll talk about these barriers, but also the strategies that are going to help you calibrate to the effort levels needed to use improved voice and movements outside of the LSVT Loud and LSVT Big treatment programs. So we'll spend some more time talking specifically about calibration and what that means. But first, we must recognize barriers that can get in the way, again, of using within normal limits movement or loudness in everyday life. So we'll break down each of these. So first, we'll talk about a sensory component or a sensory mismatch that occurs with Parkinson's disease that can make that challenging. We'll also talk about internal cueing and some a deficit that occurs with Parkinson's, again, that can make it difficult to self-cue, to know the proper amount of movement or loudness to be using. And then we'll also discuss some subtle neuropsychological changes that can happen that can also create another barrier to generalization. So we'll walk through each of these. And the first one we'll talk about is the sensory disorder. So with Parkinson's, it's more than a movement disorder, and you may be familiar with some of the movement hallmarks of Parkinson's disease, and that would include bradykinesia or slow movement and hypokinesia or small movement, and this makes it more effortful to both move and speak. But there are also sensory components to Parkinson's disease that you may not be as familiar with. So your movement, for example, may feel normal to you, even though it is smaller than normal. And also when you speak, your voice might sound normal to your ear when it's actually too quiet for others to hear. And so maybe, again, you're noticing maybe people aren't telling you you're too quiet, but they're asking you to repeat more, or they're leaning in to hear you more. Or maybe, again, you're kind of lagging behind others or just moving slower throughout your everyday activities. And this can be due to these sensory shifts or sensory changes that occur with Parkinson's disease. So a mismatch between what you perceive and what actually comes out is what's occurring here. So when you move bigger and others tell you it looks normal, it feels too big to you. So it feels funny to you to have these larger movements. And the same thing with speaking. So when you talk with what is actually normal volume, to you, what it feels like is shouting. So we're going to take a look at a couple of videos here so you can see what this means. And so the first one is a gentleman. He's practicing some big movements in an LSVT big treatment session. And while he's walking normally, it feels too big to him. And so let's take a look at his video here.
What are you laughing at?
Just imagine me walking on the streets like this.
This is normal walking, my friend.
I don't know if you noticed the subtitle, but as he's walking, he says, "Oh, imagine me walking on the streets like this." He feels funny having larger arm swing, extended gait, even though it is normal walking. And so the therapist is calibrating him to know this is the amount of bigness that you need to use to just have normal walking. And then we'll also take a look at a client commenting on how others are noticing her softer voice, or his voice, I'm sorry, well, he did not. So let's go to that video.
Can you tell us, when did you first notice changes in your voice and speech?
Notices with my speech, I think initially when I was diagnosed in 2013, I had mentioned to my neurologist that no one had really made a comment about my speech. It's just that sometimes when I would be with a group of people and make a comment, I wasn't getting response. And things weren't being addressed to whatever comment I had made. And I wondered if people had heard me or if I had been clear. So that was more my concern with my speech initially. I actually sometimes would feel ignored because no one had responded to what I had commented. And it makes you feel unimportant, I guess. I just felt kind of like, what's going on here? Why am I not getting the response or any response?
Were you the first one to notice it, or were other people commenting on it?
Well, I can tell you, Angela, I hadn't a clue. I thought I was sounding great. As far as I was concerned, I was, not dealing with Parkinson's that had been kind of diagnosed for me back in 2009. I just buried my head in the sand when I heard that, because I just was not expecting it. I was 44 years old at the time, and I just decided I'd plow ahead and keep going. But as I've mentioned before, my wife is a speech and language therapist, and she said to me two things in the first 5 years of my diagnosis. She said, "You need to deal with this, and you need to speak up." And I said, "Well, the deal with thing, I'll take care of that. But what do you mean speak up? What's the problem? Your voice is getting softer." And I said, "No, it's not." She said, "Yes, it is." And of course, my wife is always right anyway. So, I mean, that goes without saying. But the first conversation I had with a speech and language therapist, other than my wife, regarding my voice, we just sat down at a table, and she put a voice level meter between us, and we talked for about 10 minutes. And she wrote down the scores as she saw them, coming up through the voice level meter. And at the end of the conversation, she showed me my scores, and they were around 48, 49, 50 dB. And I thought, that's pretty good. And she showed me her scores, and they were kind of 89, 90, 91. And she wasn't shouting at me. And I thought, that's a difference, So that was the first time.
All right, so some of the, let me show the screen there. Some of the comments that we're hearing from them are very common with what we hear with a lot of our clients that we're seeing with Parkinson's. So the first one, Margie, so she's talking about feeling ignored. She didn't know why others were ignoring her. They weren't responding to her questions. And then the second one, we have Gary talking about how his wife told him, well, you need to speak up. But he thought, well, why would I need to do that? My voice is perfectly fine. And he didn't realize he was too soft until she pointed that out. And then also he was talking about how he started working with the speech language therapist, and the speech language therapist was measuring his loudness level on an instrument called a sound level meter. And he compared his numbers to her numbers, and hers were much louder, even though her voice was not shouting. And so that's kind of how he was starting to realize these sensory differences. And so again, these are very common with Parkinson's. So is this a real phenomena? So let's talk about some of the evidence that we've seen. So there is research showing a reduced amplitude of movement in individuals with Parkinson's that may be perpetuated by abnormally processed sensory feedback. And then also that reduced awareness of movement and vocal loudness deficits, and then a lack of self-correction, or the ability to recognize when you're being slower or smaller movements, or your voice is softer, and then being able to correct it. Also, feelings of being loud enough when too soft, or being too loud when you're in a normal loudness volume. So this is some of the evidence for a central sensory processing disorder and speech of those with Parkinson's. So we are seeing some evidence to support the comments that we're hearing from the individuals that we're working with. So when we talk about calibration, what we want is for our clients to be calibrated to the effort levels that it takes in the treatment room, and to use these same amount of effort levels outside of the treatment room. So we want to calibrate our patients to this new effort level. So what happens when clients come in is that they're typically out of calibration. And so sometimes a visual of a scale can be helpful. If you put a 100-pound weight on a scale, if it was calibrated, it would read 100. But if it's out of calibration, it's going to read a different value. So when our individuals are first coming into us for treatment, we're seeing them out of calibration. They don't know the amount of effort to equal what they need to put in to get that good within normal limits loudness voice and within normal limits movement. And so what we want by the end of treatment is that our patients are calibrated, so they know how much effort they need to use to have a voice and movement that's within normal limits in everyday living. So another barrier to generalization is internal cueing. And so what we're seeing here is, even with the education on the sensory disorder due to Parkinson's, so even when individuals are recognizing and hearing and learning that there is a sensory component and that their movements are indeed too small, or their voice is too soft, they don't simply start just moving bigger and talking louder. It's not something that just happens with the flip of a switch or once you're educated on it. So that internal cue to spontaneously and independently move bigger and talk louder is actually diminished, and there's research to support that. So patients need direction and feedback in treatment to be cued for the optimal amplitude of movement and both body and voice exercise. But what's exciting is that this intensive and extensive training can help patients to tune into these sensory changes and then begin to internally cue for that target movement and loudness, so that by the end of treatment, that internal cue is improved. There's also some subtle neuropsychological changes that can get in the way of calibrating our patients. And so some of these we'll list here. So things like depression or anxiety, or motivational apathy, memory and thinking, so slow processing, difficulties switching sets, difficulties with cognition, or defaulting to a lower effort. So these are all changes that can occur with Parkinson's, and then can also get in the way of using a louder voice or using these bigger movements in everyday life. So the good news is that when a person with Parkinson's is cued, whether for movement or for speaking, generally they can move bigger and talk louder. So if we take someone into a treatment room and we say, I want you to speak like me, or say a loud ah like this, and we model a loud ah, or we say, hello, how are you? And they can say, hello, how are you? In a louder voice, or they can copy a big movement with their arms or their legs, then generally they can do it right away. So that's exciting. So we know that we can make that change. And the brain and the body are capable of generating those louder voice and bigger movements. And so with training throughout the protocols, we can recalibrate the brain so that by the end of treatment, it becomes more automatic to use these bigger movements in that louder voice that are just getting to within normal limits, loudness or movement. But again, in the beginning, it may feel funny, it may feel too big or too loud, but we're recalibrating our patients to know the amount of effort it takes to get there. So in order for treatment to be successful and to have results that last over time, we say that calibration really is at the heart of the matter in both LSVT loud and LSVT big. And this slide shows you our definition for calibration within the treatment program. So the person with Parkinson's knows and accepts the amount of effort needed to consistently produce a louder voice and bigger, more normal amplitude movements. So that relationship between the increased effort and that output and voice or movement is established. So our goal of calibration for LSVT big is that the individual with Parkinson's uses these bigger movements habitually or more automatically in their daily tasks, and that they can maintain those bigger movements over time. So it's not that we want to see you just have great movements in the treatment room and then you walk out the door and then your movements are smaller again. We want to make sure that the great big movements that are being trained in the treatment room are carrying over into you getting out of bed and you walking with your grandkids or you gardening with your spouse. We want to make sure that all those movements are occurring outside of the treatment room as well. And on the speech side of it, we want the person with Parkinson's to use this louder voice again habitually, more automatically in their daily communication and maintain that louder voice over time. So again, when you're out of the treatment room, making sure you're using that loud voice on the phone, at meetings, at restaurants when you order. And so we want to make sure that's really the end goal. As much as we love having you in treatment and having those, those great moments of loudness or bigness in treatment, the real goal is making sure that that goes into your everyday life. So just to do a quick review or overview of LSVT big and LSVT loud, these are standardized treatment protocols based on many years of scientific research. And so they're separate protocols. As you can imagine, LSVT big is working on those bigger movements, and that's done with a LSVT big certified physical or occupational therapist. LSVT loud is working on the louder voice, and that's done with an LSVT loud certified speech language pathologist. And so each protocol consists of 16 sessions. So they're 4 consecutive days a week for 4 weeks. They're each done individually with your therapist, and they're 1-hour sessions. And then you'll also have daily homework practice all 30 days of the month. So even on the days when you're not working with your therapist, you'll also have homework. And then included within homework are what we call carryover exercises, which are chances for you to take your bigger movements or louder voice and use it in a situation in your life outside of treatment. And Laura will talk much more in depth about that. But just to give you kind of a big picture overview of what these treatment protocols look like. And within those treatment protocols, we work on 4 areas of calibration. And these this calibration piece starts on day 1 of treatment or even in your evaluation. So the therapists are helping you to recognize that your movement is smaller than normal and you need to be bigger to achieve normal movement and function. And your volume is softer than normal and you need to speak loud to achieve within normal limits loudness. And so we do that through education, the treatment exercises, carryover exercises, and your homework practice. So Laura, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you and she'll break down each one of these elements. And Laura, I can't hear you yet. I don't know if you started.
Okay. Hi,
There
Beth.
you go.
Just
Hi.
a little bit of an internet snafu there.
Okay.
Hopefully you can all hear me now. Yes.
Yes.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Beth, for that great intro. My name is Laura, and thank you for coming to our webinar today. And so now after that intro, we really want to talk to you about what happens during an LSVT loud or an LSVT big treatment session to help you become recalibrated. So that, like Beth said, after you're done with the LSVT protocols, you continue to use that louder voice and bigger movement that are more normal that you learned in therapy. And that starts with education, as Beth said, starts actually in the evaluation with those initial conversations we have with our patients. We talk really a lot about you and what treatment goals are meaningful to you. So on the next slide, you'll see that one of the first things that we educate on is the motor symptoms. The 2 of the primary motor symptoms in Parkinson's disease are bradykinesia and hypokinesia. And this makes it take more effort to move and to speak. I certainly have had patients before that, like the picture suggests, feels like it's so effortful that they feel like they're walking in mud, or it just takes more effort to be heard at a louder volume so that people can hear them. So that's one of the first things we ask about is, have you experienced that? How does it feel when you try to walk? You know, when you try to keep up with someone while you're moving around? How does it feel to use your arm or your hand that's more affected from your Parkinson's disease? Or how does it feel to really have to speak up to be heard, maybe in a noisy environment like a restaurant or a meeting or something like that? Does it take more effort to do those things than it used to prior to Parkinson's? Is your movement slower than it used to be? Is your voice softer than it used to be? So we really get a sense of what has changed as a result of having Parkinson's disease. One of the things that we also educate on is this sensory motor mismatch that occurs both in voice and speech and movement. And Beth talked about it a little bit in the intro slides, but we really like to provide education and improve your awareness of how the bradykinesia and hypokinesia and the sensory motor mismatch can affect your voice and speech. So your therapist might ask you questions like, are you asked to repeat yourself? Do people reply inappropriately? Maybe it's out of context, suggesting they didn't really understand what you were saying. Are there speaking tests that you've given up at home or at work, on the phone, with family? So these are the key points that therapists will educate you on. First, there is this sensory mismatch because of Parkinson's disease. So to talk with a voice that's easy to hear and sounds normal, so it sounds like you don't have PD, it's going to take you more effort. And you might feel too loud. You actually might even feel like you're shouting when you are speaking at a normal voice. And I think the video that you saw of the gentleman named Gary just did a really nice job um, highlighting that, you know, he was stunned that his voice was so low compared to his wife's. And, you know, when he first started speaking louder, it really felt too loud to him. So your therapist will reassure you about that and say, yes, this is a real phenomena that happens with Parkinson's disease, but we're going to work together. And the goal is through LSVT Loud, your therapist will work on recalibrating your system so you know how much effort you need to use so that you're at a normal volume and not shouting, but yet not speaking too low either. Same thing in terms of movement in this sensory motor mismatch. There is a mismatch because of Parkinson's disease. And so what the first bullet says is to move more like someone without Parkinson's disease, it will definitely take you more effort. And as the Parkinson's disease progresses in severity over time, that level of effort will likely become more. So initially in early PD might just take a little effort. In more later stages of PD, it might take a significant amount of effort to move with normal amplitude movement. And again, when your therapist first starts training you through therapy, working on bigger movements, it might feel way too big. It might feel like you're exaggerating your movements, just like that video you saw where the young guy with Parkinson's said, I can't walk down the streets like this, right? So it takes a lot of repetition to become accustomed to moving in this new way when it might feel internally to you too big. So our goal through LSVT Big is through this, we're going to work on recalibrating your system so you know exactly the right amount of effort to move more normally and more naturally. Some questions your therapist might ask you might be related to efficiency or time, like, are there certain things that take you longer to do? Perhaps it's getting dressed or getting ready in the morning. Do you walk more slowly than you used to? Do you need to allot more time to get places, like to appointments or to do things than you used to? And have others noticed changes in your movement or posture? I certainly can think of a number of patients I've had over the years where they weren't aware, for example, that their arm wasn't swinging, and maybe a family member noticed it and asked them about, why is your left arm not swinging, but your right arm is? So if you've experienced that, just know that, that is very common in Parkinson's disease. The next way that we provide education is through audio or video playback. In the case of LSVT Loud, it would be audio playback of your voice. So your therapist might say, let's listen to your voice and tell me what you notice. They'll play back both your soft and loud voice so you can compare for yourself. And um, Parkinson's doesn't naturally cause a hearing impairment. So if a person's hearing is normal or corrected with hearing aids, they could definitely tell on audio playback if their voice sounds normal to them or not. Also, we can make comments on, what does the quality sound like? Is your voice raspy or is it clear? Is it monotone or is there some inflection in your voice? And through LSVT Loud, those are all things that can be fixed. So what we know is that people with PD do have a problem with self-monitoring, and it does take this education. So let's take a look at this video of Angela and Bob.
As you listen to this, and see if you think it sounds too loud when you listen.
I'll go out and get the paper.
Perfect.
What's on your schedule today? I'll get the phone. Do you need anything while I am out?
Okay.
I will give you a call.
So what do you think? Did that sound too loud?
No, it didn't.
No.
Okay, so it can be a little surprising, I'll say a little shocking sometimes when people first hear their voices or see their movement on video or audio and have this aha moment like, wow, I really can't believe it. But it's a very, very powerful step in understanding, getting awareness of this problem of too soft a voice or too small a movement. So we do the same thing with movement in LSVT Big. We'll do video analysis. We'll, you maybe use a smartphone or something like that and take a quick video of you walking or getting out of a chair, getting your jacket on, maybe just a couple of different functional activities that you do on a day-to-day basis. And then we'll play it back immediately for the patient so that you can see, has your posture changed? Has your arm swing changed? Is your step length looking normal? And that really is helpful in helping patients to recognize the change in their movement or posture or speed when they can see themselves on camera like that. And we usually immediately follow up with another walk or another task using amplitude so that they can compare and see that, wow, if I give it more effort, if I move bigger, it actually looks quite normal. And that can be really motivating for patients to know that, gosh, I have some power over this. Like if I think big, I can move much better. One of the other things that we really find important to educate on is non-motor symptoms. Parkinson's disease, like Beth said, is much more than a motor disorder. And the range of non-motor symptoms like depression, apathy, anxiety, thinking, or cognitive changes can really affect a person's motivation to do exercise, their awareness, their ability to remember to do their exercises on a daily basis, and even their ability to remember to use a louder voice or a bigger movement. So we do ask questions such as these. The first of is, how is your energy level? If a person is feeling really fatigued and tired, it can be difficult to get motivated to do their daily exercises or use the effort they need. And so if we have an awareness of that, then we can make a strategy or a plan to help that patient to be successful. We also like to know what you do during the day. What's your typical day like? And this is not just to be friendly and get to know you, although we really love that as therapists. It's also to identify, when do you use your voice in communication most often? Maybe it's related to communication with a spouse or family. Maybe it's at work. Maybe it's in the community activities that you do. And same thing with movement. What kind of activities do you do during the day? And that can really help us to plan functional tasks that are incorporated into your LSVT program that are meaningful to you. We want to know if there's anything that you've lost confidence in doing, or maybe there's something that you used to love doing, but you've given up because of the symptoms related to Parkinson's. It could be something recreational, like, I used to love golfing, but I'm no longer feeling confident walking in the golf course, or my drive just isn't as good as it used to be. It could be related to, communication. Maybe you used to engage in a book club or, support group meetings, but it became too frustrating on a communication level. And so it's difficult for you, or maybe you just even stop going. Those are things we definitely aim to restore through the LSVT programs. We like to know if there's been any change in your thinking as well, and your therapist might actually do some screening tests to just identify if you're having any problems with memory or kind of thinking about procedures, how to do things, dual tasking, multitasking. Those are all important things for us to be aware of, again, so that we can appropriately plan the treatment and help you even despite some of those challenges. And lastly, we'd like to know, do you ever have feelings of anxiety, worry, sadness, or depression? Certainly, we want to, point you to resources that can help you with those mood issues, but also they affect a person's motivation to participate in activities that were once meaningful to them, participate in therapy, and those can be barriers to participation and barriers to calibration. So we definitely have strategies and ways to help you through those things. So the education is ongoing. That really starts during day one of evaluation, and honestly, it should happen every single day of those 16 sessions of LSVT Loud or LSVT Big. So let's talk about what actually happens during treatment and how do we incorporate calibration treatment training during the treatment. So on this next slide, let's first talk about really why it matters. LSVT is hard work and you're going to feel tired, but exercise is medicine. And with your therapist's encouragement, you are going to make really big improvements. And so this first line says, your therapist must include opportunities every session to make you feel more comfortable with louder voice and bigger movement so you feel confident. Remember, if it feels too loud to you or feels too big to you, it's going to take some trust building between you and your therapist. And your therapist is someone that is going to make sure that you end up looking normal and sounding normal. They do not want you walking out the door to, actually move into life and be shouting or sounding angry or moving in a crazy big way, even if you feel like you are internally. Their job is to shape movement and shape voice that is indeed normal. And next one is you're working hard enough to achieve the results. So your therapist will push you, to make sure that you're getting the results that you deserve through this, intensive training over 1 month. They will also make sure that you sound and look natural as you speak and move. This doesn't happen in one session. This happens over actually all 16 sessions to get to the point where, you're sounding good, you're looking good, and you know how to continue to do this at home on your own. And lastly, your therapist is going to help you remember to use that louder voice and bigger movement in everything that you say or do. Again, this takes a lot of repetition and training and some skill strategies that we incorporate throughout treatment. So let's take a look at this next slide. There are definitely calibration training activities that go on during the LSVT Loud session. And let's talk about exactly what your therapist does. First of all, they are going to drive you. So it is hard work. Even voice exercises are hard work. They're going to make sure that you're using sufficient effort to use a more normal voice during your voice exercises, reading practice, conversation, communication practice. They're going to be monitoring it with a special sound pressure level meter to make sure that you are at that normal zone. The second one is this. When you hit that target where it's like, yes, that was the volume that I wanted. I could completely hear you. It was normal decibels. It's great. Do it again. So your brain begins to internalize when you did it correctly. The third one is retraining your sensory perception and internal cueing. And that kind of goes with the second one. First, you have to recognize how loud is loud enough. And then through a lot of repetition and training, your internal cueing capabilities will improve. And you'll be able to detect to a greater degree when you're not loud enough. And lastly, we want you to become more comfortable with your louder voice so you'll use it outside the treatment room and feel confident about that. So let's take a look at this video of Angela and our therapist Jessica with their patients providing some feedback during the LSVT Loud session.
Feel that 8. Good. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Woo! Good work.
Thanks.
Tell me thanks, even louder.
Thanks.
Okay, that's the voice I want you using all the time.
Excellent. It sounded great. How'd that feel?
Felt very good.
Good, but oh, what happened to my loud voice there?
You sounded very good.
That's better.
I will go down and get the mail.
Good, keep it loud.
What's for dinner tonight? Good night, I love you.
Okay, good night, I love you. Little more of your loudness.
Good night, I love you.
Okay, good. Now, you just said some of these you don't like in your loud voice. Tell me one of the cars you don't like on this list.
I don't like the Lamborghini Countach.
Okay, good loudness when you told me that. Excellent.
Okay, so I think I love that video because it really shows how these therapists are constantly observing. They're not letting their clients get away with a softer voice, even for a second during that loud therapy session. And this is not to be, mean or anything like that. It's simply to ingrain in our patient's brain that, all the time, I really need to prioritize thinking loud with my voice. So we do the same thing in LSVT big during the exercise practice and during the functional practice as well. The first thing we need to do is look at any movements that are too small and drive them so that that movement is rescaled to normal. And that could be what we call gross motor movements. That can be things like rolling over in bed, getting out of a recliner, walking. It could be fine motor tasks like buttoning buttons, handwriting. Whatever is too small, we drive it to become big enough. When it is big enough, we reinforce and we say, yes, that was the right amount of effort. That was exactly the right amount of size or effort you used when you were reaching or signing your name or writing the list or whatever it was that they were working on. We retrain the sensory and internal cue in the same way that we do during LSVT loud sessions so that our client has a really good idea of just how big they need to move to be within that normal zone. And lastly, we help our clients to become more comfortable with bigger movements and posture so they'll continue to use it outside of the treatment room. So let's take a look at this next video. Beth is going to pull it up now. And this is of Jenny, one of our LSVT Big PT faculty, working with Bob on just the task of getting his jacket on.
So to start with, Bob, would you just please put your jacket on for me like you usually do? Very nice. So what you may have noticed is Increased time, predominantly the first place we saw that is in the reach of trying to get the second arm to the jacket, and then also taking it from that point to being able to get it up over his shoulders with the collar in the right place. And that is very commonly what we see, the main sticking points that people get stuck on with that jacket. Would you say that's the sticking points that you notice too?
Those are them.
All right, yes, yes. So we're going to go through that and do it again, okay, with the big effort, pushing in, with each arm movement, and with the pulling up of the coat. We're going to put it all together.
Okay.
All right, ready?
Here we go.
Big reach. Good. Big punch back. Big pull up. Good. One more big pull up.
Half the time.
Half the time. You got
What am I
it.
going to use for an excuse to be late now?
It'll eliminate that excuse, won't it?
Yes, it will.
Okay, but that's the amount of effort that I want you to use every time you put your arm into the jacket, okay?
Yes.
And I want you to try it every time, whether it's your jacket, whether it's your shirt, or anything that you're using like that. You need to have increased effort as you're pushing through, okay?
Got it.
Let's get it off one more time with nice big effort. Good. Big pull out.
Big pull out and
Yep.
just cover it up. And
Good.
Good and good.
Very nice.
I am now the master of my coat.
You are.
All right. I love the last line he says there when he says, I am now the master of my coat. And you could see that when Jenny was working with him, she was really first initially looking at what part of that getting his jacket on is too small and too slow. And those are the things that she really focused on training using amplitude and effort to make that task more normal. Now, one thing to note with both LSVT Loud and LSVT Big is it's not just as simple as saying, well, now that you know that you're too soft or too small or slow with your movements, just be bigger and louder. If it were only that easy. But in reality, we know that it takes all of 16 sessions. It takes a massive amount of repetition of practice to really make these bigger movements and louder voice a new normal for our clients. So one of the other ways that we do this is through what's called carryover assignments. And this is the third way that we nail calibration, as we say, during our LSVT Loud and LSVT Big sessions. So what are carryover assignments? These are assignments that your therapist mandates of how you're going to use your bigger movement and louder voice in daily life outside of therapy all 30 days of treatment. So they're really, really important because you build a trust relationship with your therapist during the therapy session, but you really do have to a little bit jump off that proverbial cliff to start using those bigger movements and louder voice around other people outside of the treatment room. So we say it's where the rubber hits the road. They're so important, and we really try to make the tasks specific to you and important to you. So your therapist might say to you at the end of your LSVT session, what do you plan to do today? And maybe you say, well, I'm going to go to the grocery store and I have to pick up a few things, and then I'm going to go home and I'm going to put the groceries away and make dinner. You know, it could be something like that, for example. So your therapist is listening and thinking, okay, what within that could we ask the patient to use their bigger movements or louder voice? So for LSVT Big, it might be something like, you know, I want you to use big posture, big steps when you're pushing the cart. You really use your big reaches when you are reaching for things off the grocery store shelves, putting them into your trunk. It could be a variety of things. For your voice, it could be things like when you're checking out to use your louder voice when you greet the cashier, or when you make your payment, or when you see others in the store, or ask questions about certain items if they're in stock. So your therapist gives you a new assignment all 30 days of the month that's going to address that sensory mismatch issue so that you become convinced that these bigger movements and louder voice are actually good. They actually helped you in everyday life. And so over time, it systematically increases and builds your confidence of using your louder voice and bigger movements. So after you are assigned a carryover assignment, guess what? The next day, the first thing your therapist is going to ask you is, hey, tell me about your carryover assignment. How did it go? In this way, your therapist is going to help keep you accountable, and we're hoping to hear that you had a really positive experience. So in this one, this is a follow-up video that Beth is going to pull up in just a second here. And this client, his carryover assignment the previous day, he was going to go visit his 100-year-old mother and wish her a happy birthday. And he was going to use his left arm, his most affected arm, to open up the door and walk big in to see her. So let's see how that follow-up conversation goes.
All right, Jerry, so one of your big homework things as we're going through this LSVT program was seeing how big you could go as you go through the doorway. So, especially as you went to go visit your mom, we wanted to see how large you could go as you go through the door, really use those arms to pull. So tell me a little bit how that went and how that's kind of carried over throughout the week.
When I visited, I used my left hand to open big, and ever since then I've been using my left hand and left arm to open doors.
Good.
It's been working well.
Really good. And you feel like that's kind of carried over into your day-to-day life?
It has carried over.
Perfect. That's awesome. Well, we'll continue to build off of that and just keep moving as big as we can.
Okay.
Great.
All right, so that one was specific to LSVT big, but it would be a similar type of conversation for LSVT loud. The fourth way that we nail calibration is through homework, and that can be a dreaded word, but the homework for LSVT is very simple, but yet very important. And here's why it matters. First of all, 16 hours of therapy might seem like a lot, but really it's not. Your therapist sees you, 1 hour a day. That means there's 23 hours a day when they're not seeing you, and you really need extra practice outside of therapy of your LSVT loud and LSVT big exercises. It also helps you to build a routine so that after the month of therapy is done, you're already in this habit and you can continue on with your daily practice and help you maintain your gains over time. And together, those promote further comfort of using your bigger movements and louder voice in everyday life. So in the next slide, we'll see a few ways that how your therapist incorporates calibration into homework. First of all, you'll get a homework log where you can record what you've been doing every day, and your therapist can follow up on this with you and help problem solve if you're having any issues. They'll ask you how you're feeling, doing your homework, using your louder voice and bigger movements at home. They can also provide you supportive tools. Like we have videos of all of the LSVT loud and LSVT big exercises. We have a software program called the LSVT Companion or Coach. And sometimes it actually helps to have someone at home too, to encourage you or to remind you to kind of serve as a coach at home too. And lastly, we make sure that your effort at home matches your effort in treatment so that you're, really getting the most out of your home practice. Now, we've been talking a lot about calibration, and one of the things we want you to know is it's not just theoretical, that there's actually published research evidence showing these sensory processing deficits and calibration that occur after LSVT loud and LSVT big. And Beth is going to just describe to you one study that gives neural evidence on LSVT loud, and then I'll talk about one study on LSVT big.
All right, thank you, Laura. Yeah, so there's been a few imaging studies that have been done looking pre and post LSVT loud to see if there are actually changes in what's being activated in the brain and different brain areas after LSVT loud. And we are seeing a common finding. So of the 4 studies that have been done, we're seeing a right-sided shift of activation to areas involved in prosodics, so things like pitch and loudness, monitoring of speech. And so the study that we just completed match some of the other studies, and it was really exciting. If you look at the image on your slide here, and in particular looking at this area number 6, so on this left column we see the brains of individuals with Parkinson's at baseline, and then we see them at post-treatment, so that's 4 weeks after doing LSVT loud, and then also 7 months after baseline. So we're looking at them over the long term. And right here, the area number 6 is the right auditory cortex. And so we see an increase in activation post-treatment. And so that what we're seeing there is likely a correspondence to calibration. So that's an area where of the brain, which we know is can be linked to those changes in calibration. So now patients are showing that they can use that louder voice. They know the effort that it takes to use that louder voice outside of treatment. So it's really exciting to see this. Not only do we have behavioral evidence in science to show us that yes, patients are actually getting louder at the end of treatment, but we also have changes at the level of the brain to show us that you're also making changes to different patterns in your brain that are being activated post-treatment. So that's really exciting to see, to have that body of evidence, not only in those behavioral changes, but also in the neural mechanisms or the changes at the level of the brain.
All right, thanks, Beth. And I'll just go as quickly as I can, but still give you the key points on these last slides. This was a study that looked at LSVT Big's ability to provide what we call proprioceptive recalibration. So in other words, understanding can they sense when they're making errors in their movement. So in this study, they had 30 people with Parkinson's, 15 healthy matched controls. 11 of those people received LSVT Big, and they found that people with PD had bigger pointing errors. So they weren't as accurate in estimating correct movement patterns. They did LSVT Big in these 11, and they found out that 4 weeks after LSVT Big, and even to a greater degree 4 weeks later, so 8 weeks post-treatment, as a result of continued home exercise program, their proprioceptive performance was better, and that LSVT Big training may achieve a re-calibration proprioceptive processing in people with Parkinson's disease. And so I think it's an early study. Definitely more studies need to be done, but this, among other studies, does recognize that there is this proprioceptive impairment in PD because of altered processing of this type of information on a subcortical or cortical level. So in this next slide, here's just a few things of what your therapist look for. They want to know, do you have any aha moments? Are you discovering like, wow, I used my louder voice, or I used my bigger movements, and I actually, was successful, and people responded positively to me. People said that, gosh, I didn't have to repeat myself, or you were able to do that, get out of the lazy boy in one try. What do other people say? And therapists are always watching for your spontaneous movement between repetitions of exercise. Maybe you get to the water fountain and you keep using your big movements. That would be a really positive sign that you are on your path to calibration. Also, if you begin to be able to detect and correct your errors, that's also a very positive sign that you are on your way to being calibrated as well. Some other signs that we'll see on the next slide, you notice that there's a functional impact outside of treatment. I had a patient one time that had a very, very heavy gait on his farm, and he was never able to successfully give it, open it without a lot of effort. And he came back to therapy and he said, you know what, I got to that gate today and I thought to myself, I'm going to use like bigger effort, bigger movement to do that. And it came right open, like it wasn't a problem at all. So when we hear these things, it's very positive. Another sign, our patients give more details about their carryover assignment. You might find yourself, remembering to think loud or think big more often. So you're cueing yourself. And lastly, your speech and movement might take less effort. We certainly have patients at the end of the 4 weeks of LSVT say, it just doesn't take quite as much effort as it used to be. used to take to be heard or move in a way that is normal, or the patient accepts their effort. So here's a little video of Gary. I'll just let him speak for himself here.
What I used to say, like for about a couple of years after doing LSVT Loud, I used to say to people, look, if I'm shouting in my head, I know you can hear me, you know, because that's what it felt like. It definitely felt like you really had to kind of up the volume, and I was, you know, 40 decibels behind the speech and language therapist at the start. So that's what I gained like over the course of the weeks that I did the actual course. But over time, like over the last, that's 5 years ago, 6 years ago, nearly now at this stage, over the last 3 or 4 years, I've gotten used to kind of making sure that I ramp it up when I'm in company.
All right. So you could see that he said he got used to, you know, ramping it up. He recognized that that was what was necessary to be heard, and he valued that. So in summary here, we hope you have discovered that LSVT Loud and LSVT Big are more than just exercises. There's a lot more that needs to be done to help people translate their movement and their voice into daily function. That's really the goal of the LSVT programs. There are also some other points that we want you to remember. We use this calibration training to overcome sensory internal cueing and neuropsychological changes. So what we call those non-motor symptoms that make translation of louder voice and bigger movements into daily function a challenge. Within treatment, we use those 4 ways to nail calibration. So education, treatment exercises and hierarchies, carryover assignments, and homework exercises to achieve calibration. So it's really ongoing, woven into every aspect of the LSVT treatment sessions. It does take the skill of an LSVT certified clinician to help you to become calibrated to your best ability and achieve the outcomes that you deserve. So while we are preparing for questions here, just want to let you know that there is another free webinar in May on what do you do after LSVT to maintain your treatment gain. So we hope that you're able to join us for that free public webinar that's on our blog. You can go to the May events and register for that. For those of you that need to leave right now, we just want to say thank you for coming. We hope that this webinar was helpful to you and that you learned a few new things. If you'd like to stay on for questions, Beth and I will both be available to take any questions. You can type your questions into the chat box or the question box on your control panel. You can raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon if you prefer to ask your question out loud, or you can email info@lsvtglobal.com at any time and ask your question. There's also an opportunity to ask your question on the survey, and we'll read all of those survey results and respond to you if you think of anything later as well. So I'm going to turn over to Beth. I think at least one question came in, and if you have questions, we'll stay on it for a couple more minutes.
Great, thanks, Laura. Yeah, so one person was just asking if this will be available on demand as well, and it will. So if you go to blog.lsvtglobal.com and under the webinars tab, this will be available on demand so others can watch it as well. It usually takes up to 48 hours just to get it processed and on the website, so it might take about 48 hours for it to be active there. And then we had another question come through. So why does the Parkinson's patient not recognize that his or her voice does not sound as loud as people without Parkinson's? So it's a great question. And I know we've talked about that sensory impairment, but I think the question is more, you know, why is that occurring? So there is dysfunction of the feed forward and feedback control, likely caused by basal ganglia impairment. So what that means, that feedback would be when others are kind of telling you the type of loudness or how loud to get or that you are too soft. And the feed forward would be when, for example, your therapist was telling you, well, now you need to use that loud voice when you're at the dinner table or when you're on your call for work. So that feed forward and feedback loop has some dysfunction. caused by that basal ganglia impairment. There's also disturbed sensory gating or filtering in Parkinson's. And then I think I mentioned this just a little bit. There's some diminished energization, and that is together with dysfunctional self-monitoring mechanisms. So with Parkinson's, a lot of times we're defaulting to this low energy, low effort, even if it's known that more effort needs to be used to get that louder voice. So that's kind of just the default that occurs in Parkinson's. So hopefully that kind of helps answer, I think, the origin of where is this coming from. And then that coupled with things like those neuropsychological challenges that we talked about, that's slower thinking, slow learning that can occur, problems in the procedural memory, and then also those deficits with internal cueing. So kind of that all together makes for this sensory mismatch of, I feel like I'm loud enough, but when you ask me to get louder, I feel like I'm shouting. And so that's something that we're working on through treatment to retrain that and recalibrate that. Okay, and looks like there's a hand raised. Let me see. Okay, so Carol, if I'm going to unmute your microphone and you can go ahead and ask your question out loud to the group. Oh, it looks like you're still muted. I think you'll have to unmute yourself, or you can type your question into the question box.
Okay, thank you. I would like to know, I'm very interested in signing up for a physical therapist that is LSVT certified. How do I go about that?
Great. And Laura, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for asking. I'm sure there's others that have that question as well. It's very easy. Go to our website, which is lsvtglobal.com, and I think it's displayed on this end slide right here. And then there's a bright orange button up in the corner that says Find LSVT Clinicians. If you click on that, you can select the type of therapist you want. So in your case, you would click on LSVT Big, and then you can put in your zip code or your city and state, whatever search criteria you want. There's a little box to check that you agree to the search terms, and then everyone in that area around you will pop up. Then it's just a matter of looking through and seeing, is there one close to me, and maybe taking a look at their practice setting, because there are therapists that work in home health, for example, that might not be able to see patients on an outpatient basis. So if you have any difficulties, really understanding which therapist to look for, we can definitely help you with that too. You can email info@lsvtglobal.com if you're having any hard times finding someone who's LSVT Big certified in your area. And the same process would occur if you were looking for an LSVT Loud speech therapist. You would just change that search criteria to LSVT Loud.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Can you tell me also what LSVT stands for?
Sure, that's a great question. LSVT stands for Lee Silverman Voice Treatment. Lee Silverman was the woman for whom the treatment was named. She was really the inspiration for the treatment, and her family helped to provide support for the initial research and development on this protocol when it was developed back in the late 1980s. And so we're very honored to name it after her. VT, yeah, voice treatment, because LSVT initially started off as only a speech treatment. So now we call it LSVT Loud to designate the speech treatment, and LSVT Big to designate the physical and occupational therapy treatment, which came later.
Thank you very much. That's very clear.
Okay, thanks for asking.
All right, well, thank you. I didn't see any other questions come through. But again, feel free to email us if you think of any others. And we hope that you can attend a webinar with us again in the future. So thanks to everyone in the audience, and thank you to Laura. We hope to see you again. Bye.
Bye.